godfather of all Trueborn Canucks and pure-hearted Canadjuns.
By Darcy John.
In 1534, French explorer Jacques Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, landing at modern-day Gaspé, Quebec. He claimed the land for France and made contact with local aboriginals. Cartier made 2 further voyages to the region, in 1535 to 1536 and 1541 to 1542, during which he explored more of Quebec and attempted, without success, to set up a permanent French colony. This Breton marked the beginning of Canadian history because he was mandated, in 1532, by the King François I of France, to take possession of a new continent to the west, on the other side of the Atlantic. Cartier fulfilled this mission 2 years later, thanks to a record crossing of the ocean. A Mariner's Calling. Jean Cartier, 1428 to 1488, age 60 YS, had inherited the lands of his father near Saint Malo, thus it is assumed that he was the eldest son. Moreover, he was a merchant and a banker and lived in the Cartier Manor House at Limoilou, near St. Malo. The lands he had inherited and the large estates were farmed by the peasants who also lived on this property. Jean Cartier was not only a man of power in the region of St. Malo, but possessed much influence as superintendent of finance of France under King Charles VII. Note: the superintendent of finance collected all tax monies and expended them in accordance with written order of the king and council. Jean Cartier of St. Malo, Brittany, France married Guillemette Baudouin from the neighboring town of St. Coulomb, Brittany, France in 1456. Children of Guillemette Baudouin and Jean Cartier are, as follows: I. Jacques Jamet Cartier, b. 1458, St. Malo, France, d. 1509, age 51 ys, 2. Jean Cartier 3. Etienne Cartier, b. 1467, Etienne Cartier was the third child born to Jean Cartier. His older brother, Jacques Jamet Cartier, was quite famous as a pilot on the flagship of the Duke of Brittany, and Etienne's later success was much due to the guidance and solicitude of Jacques. As he grew older, Etienne accompanied Jacques on many of his trips to the court of France and was Jacques' aide in attending to his duties as chancellor. 5 children were born to Jean and Guillemette Cartier, all boys, all born at the manor house at Limoilou. Jacques Jamet Cartier, son of Jean and Guillemette Cartier, married Jesseline Jansard 1485 at Limoilou, France. The couple had several children whose paternity is not in doubt, except for Jacques. The newborn babe was registered in the Cathedral of St. Malo as, simply, a child of Jamet Cartier, which is why, finally, researchers do not trust it. Cross-checks from the main documented moments in the explorer's life only suggest that he was born between June 7 and December 23, 1491. Children of Jacques Jamet Cartier and Jesseline Jansard are, as follows: I. Jacques Cartier, born on 31/12/1491, St. Malo, Île-et-Vilaine, Bretagne, France, died of illness on 0109/1557, St. Malo, Île-et-Vilaine, France. No act of baptism recorded. Young Jacques attended the local schools and played with his brother Lucas and his 2 sisters, Johanne and Bertheline, as well as the neighboring children and his cousins. He had an especial liking for his sister Johanne, which continued throughout his life. Jacques was a normal and studious boy and early became tremendously interested in the vessels moored on the waterfront of St. Malo harbor, which he frequented daily, bothering the sailors with innumerable questions. St. Malo was a prosperous town and the boy's father was likewise prosperous and one of the leading citizens. Young Jacques' love of ships and the sea prompted his father to see to it that the boy was fully tutored in navigation and seamanship, because a mariner's calling was held in high esteem, and, even as a boy, he looked to the sea as his chosen calling. Duke Charles of Burgundy. On February 6, 1476, Duke Charles of Burgundy marched from Besançon against the Swiss. King Louis XI, presumably, befriending Charles, had secretly alerted the Swiss, and as a traitor to Duke Charles, he had secret agents in both camps. Duke Charles marched against the Swiss with a powerful train of artillery and 40,000 men, gleefully anticipating an easy conquest and the taking of Switzerland. A battle was fought at Granson in Vaud district, and the underrated Swiss army so disastrously defeated the French that Duke Charles, besides losing half of his army, lost all his artillery and his huge baggage train. In his flight, he was accompanied by only 5 mounted retainers, including his next in command, Jacques Cartier, who had strenuously objected to a war with the Swiss. Duke Charles also lost his store of personal jewels and precious stones that were in a locked case in a wagon of the train. The Great Diamond of Charles, which was taken earlier from the crown of the Great Mogul, was lost. It turned up later in the possession of the Emperor of Austria, who had purchased it for a trifle from the Swiss. Duke Charles was mad with rage and calling his advisors together to raise another army to again fight the Swiss. The sage advice of his generals and commanders failed to show him the folly of another war with the powerful Swiss who were defending their homeland. In June 1476 the great army of Charles, now geared down to only needed arms and food, reached the town of Morat, a short distance from Bern. As the Swiss advanced, Jacques Cartier drew his lines of battle, which were perfectly suited to the hilly terrain and valleys. Pelting rain fell on June 22, and the Swiss, hidden by fog, fell upon the French. In the melee of the raging battle, more than half of the French foot soldiers were slain, and all of the cavalry, who did not flee, were killed. Charles and his living commanders, including Jacques Cartier, fled the field with only a dozen of his cavalry. Charles was wild with rage on reaching home. He ordered the raising of another army, but the French peasants refused to go once again against the terrible Swiss. Duke René II of Lorraine had an opportunity to down Charles the Bold. Nevertheless, Charles was able to collect a small army and, on October 22, 1476, he besieged Nancy, and Duke René fled. Charles was still besieging Nancy on January 4, 1477, when René appeared with a fresh army. Charles was advised that he could not hope to cope with a sortie out of Nancy with René II falling on his flanks and rear, but he would not listen. The battle was fought, Charles was killed, and, with a few other commanders and faithful retainers, Jacques Cartier escaped to St. Malo. What he had gained for his years of war, his contributions of money and produce from his estate, and the loss of many of his own people, nothing but a medal of honor from Charles that he dared not display. He wisely decided to spend the remainder of his days at home, husband his resources and rear his family. At the death by assassination of his brother Jacques, age 52 ys, in 1509, Étienne continued in management of his own and Jacques' estates at Limoilou, awaiting the time when Jacques' son Jacques, the explorer, could take over this duty. However, Jacques became a sea captain, and, so, he was unable to devote time to the duties of farming and left matters in the hands of his uncle Étienne. After blessed St. Jeanne d'Arc had been martyred, Jean Cartier fled back to his estate at St. Malo, where he was assassinated, in 1488, by a hired henchman of King Charles. At the death of his father, Jacques Cartier became head of the family. Late in Jacques' life commenced the heavier wars that lasted for 50 years under 3 French kings. Jacques became Chancellor of France in the councils of King Charles VIII, who was a fantastic youth dreaming of conquest and the enlargement of his kingdom. The Chancellor of France solely made valid all opinions of the king. He, likewise, was keeper of the national seal, and he alone could use it to validate documents. Jacques lavished his attention on his younger brother Étienne and saw to it that he was given every advantage. When Jacques became Chancellor of France, he made Étienne his aide and chief assistant. Étienne acquired a large tract of land adjacent to Jacques, a few miles from St. Malo, and both estates were known by the common name Limoilou. Étienne supervised both estates, and his efforts were successful because of this, and because the lives of Jacques Jamet and Étienne were inseparably woven together. Most of the history of the two is parallel. Portugal had been in the race to explore routes to Asia for more than a century when one of its explorers, Bartolomeu Dias, was the first to round the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa in 1487. Satisfied with this success, King John II of Portugal turned down Christopher Columbus' 1489 proposal to look for a route to Asia by going west. Shortly thereafter, Columbus discovered America in the name of Spain. Some time later, it was learned that John Cabot had possibly reached Asia for England by going through the northwest. The Beheim Globe of 1492, the same year that Columbus set out on his first voyage, depicts an empty ocean between Europe and Asia. 10 years later, the Cantonneau chart, 1502, originated by the survivors of the Gaspar Cortereal voyages, was the first to depict any part of Canada. In the north-central part of the chart is the southern tip of Greenland and the east coast of Newfoundland. A different outline of this area appeared a few years later with the La Cosa, 1500-08, Contarini, 1506, and Royce, 1507, world maps, based on the hypothesis that Greenland and Newfoundland were joined, all part of a vast northeastern extension of Asia. The Royce map shows the earliest surviving place name in Canada. Baccalaureus is now Bacalou Island off Breakheart Point, between Trinity and Conception Bays. Voyages of discovery shortly before the end of the 15th century, the lure of unknown lands to the west was again felt in Europe, and America was rediscovered. Europeans sought once again to establish colonies throughout the 16th century, the Spanish and Portuguese primarily in South America, and the English and French principally in North America. Of all these nations, only the Spanish succeeded in making large encroachments. Numerous expeditions set out for Canada during this period, from the one by John Cabot in 1497 to that of Jacques Cartier, but no permanent colony was established. Canada therefore remained the exclusive domain of the natives until the 17th century. Nevertheless, the land claims made by Cartier in the St. Lawrence Valley were recognized in Europe, where the territories that he discovered were identified on maps as Nouveau France. It would have been unthinkable for these intrepid explorers to set out in search of unknown lands, inhabited possibly by natives of unknown disposition, but presumably hostile, without ensuring a minimum of security through effective weapons and men who knew how to handle and maintain them. Therefore, the sailors from all the European nations who signed on for these expeditions had to be able to become men-at-arms when danger threatened. All ships were equipped with a supply of swords, spears and harquebuses, as well as a few artillery pieces. The distinction between naval vessels and merchant vessels was rather vague. In general, ordinary ships engaging in trade one year could be equipped for war the next and sent off on military campaigns, then reassigned once again to transporting merchandise. A few notable exceptions did exist, such as the Great Harry, a large British man of war. Thanks to the development of ships able to withstand long ocean voyages, 16th-century Europeans enjoyed a revolutionary advantage over all other peoples of the times. Not only did America come within their reach, but they also succeeded in circumnavigating Africa. The Portuguese, who were dominant in this kind of exploration at the time, had reached India in 1500, and then on to the Far East. Footmen and soldiers. Great advances were also made in the 14th and 15th centuries in the areas of weapons and tactics. The result was the advent of a new type of men-at-arms, professional soldiers. In the Middle Ages, knights were the prototypical warriors on the battlefields of Europe. Because of their extremely heavy equipment, they moved about on horseback. Dressed first in coats of mail and helmets, they were eventually enveloped from head to foot in suits of steel armor. Those who fought on foot, or footmen as they were generally known, were usually archers and pikemen. They were poorly equipped and were even forbidden to carry the weapons of gentlemen, such as swords, which might have saved their lives in combat. They had little defensive equipment, even though they were very exposed in battle. The situation changed when armies of knights began to suffer stinging defeats at the hands of simple footmen. This occurred in the 14th century during a number of battles pitting knights against bands of rough Swiss mountaineers armed only with longbows, crossbows, long pikes, and halberds, which are pikes with axe heads such as those still carried today by the Pope's Swiss guards. Assembled in close formation, the pikemen and halberdiers formed a kind of gigantic porcupine which the knights and their mounts proved unable to penetrate. The nobles suffered terrible losses, while the Swiss acquired a military fame that accompanied them for centuries, due to this new technique that revolutionized the art of war. The 14th century also saw the advent of firearms on battlefields, in the form of heavy bombards, the ancestor of cannons, which were especially useful for sieges. It was not until a century later that harquebuses, the first portable firearms, made their appearance. They were capable of penetrating armor. In the Middle Ages, knights and noble lords regularly maintained in their retinues sergeants and archers, who trained and led other subjects who were obliged to serve in the army for 40 days per campaign. As the infantry became the heart of the army, the importance of footmen increased, as did their relative numbers and the length of time they had to serve. Rarely paid, these men often survived by looting and extorting money and goods from humble people living near the battlefields. When the military campaign ended, some of them became veritable public dangers. They were even called looters and eaters of the people. In order to mitigate these abuses, princes gradually began to pay men to devote themselves to the practice of war. The French word solder, meaning to pay, was thus the origin of the lovely name of soldier 12 by which they came to be known. In the 15th century, the practice of paying men to take up the trade of soldiery became widespread. The Cabots and the Cortereal brothers. Naturalized as a citizen of the Republic of Venice, now Italy, in 1476, the experienced navigator Giovanni Caboto, c. 1449 c. 1499, known to the English as John Cabot, was hired by King Henry VII of England in the mid-1490s to make a voyage of discovery westward across the Atlantic Ocean, seeking a new commercial sea route to Asia, India and Cathay, viz. the fabled Northwest Passage. In the year of our Lord 1494, John Cabot, a Venetian, and his son Sebastian, discovered that land which no man before time had attempted, on the 24th of June, about 5 of the clock early in the morning. This land he called Prima Vista. The inhabitants of this island used to wear beast skins, and have them in as great estimation, as we have our finest garments. His soil is barren in some places, and yieldeth little fruit, but it is full of white lions, and stags far greater than ours. It yieldeth plenty of fish, and those very great, as seals, and those which commonly we call salmons. There are soles also above a yard in length, but especially there is great abundance of that kind of fish which the salvages call bacalaos. Hakluyt 511, 1589. Very few hard facts are known about Cabot or his trip, but his journey is recognized as an important symbolic start point for the story of European settlement of North America. The earliest surviving documents related to Cabot's explorations are the letters of patent which were granted to the English king's Italian navigator, on March 5, 1496. Cabot left Bristol in May 1497, 1 month later, he reached Newfoundlands, revealing large schools of cod and whales near Labrador. He disembarking briefly and claimed the island of Newfoundland for England. He then skirted the shore for some 30 days without seeing anyone, and returned to England at the beginning of August, full of enthusiasm and convinced that he had reached Asia. In fact, Cabot was the first to report on a part of America after Christopher Columbus, but his explorations were in colder regions on the shores of what is Canada today. In 1492, the year following the birth of Jacques Cartier, converso Jew Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean to discover America for the Queen of Castile, later, Spain. It is a little known thing that he had in his possession certain documents, such as maps and charts, either based on or created by Admiral from China, who had circumnavigated the globe ys prior. His landfall remains unknown. Neither a ship's log nor any authentic account of this voyage has been preserved. It is only because of numerous references found here and there that historians have been able to piece together Cabot's exploration in North America. On the whole, it is agreed that the navigator visited somewhere between Labrador and Cape Breton, most likely the east coast of Newfoundland. C'est dans au Cap Perce, et nul part ailers, que Ceylon la carte de 1544, Jean et Sébastien Cabot ont atterri, c'est là que les premières entrées les navigates du XVe siècle, ils auraient foulé le sol du continent américain, et plant les bannières de Saint George's et de Saint Mark, le samedi 24 juin 1497, à 5 heures du matin. Horace, 66, 1882. The fabled Northwest Passage. When John Cabot ventured into the North Atlantic aboard the Matthew in 1497, his goal had nothing to do with fish, even though his discovery of the waters of riches was unquestionably the most dramatic result of that voyage. Cabot, like Columbus before him, hoped to prove that a direct sea route existed between Europe and Asia. He did not know that a continental landmass entirely unknown to Europeans blocked his way. As Europeans became aware that a new world existed across the Atlantic, many found ways to profit by the discovery through the fishery or by the fur trade. Others, however, remained determined to find a sea route to Asia. This belief led to the search for the fabled Northwest Passage, a search that persisted for centuries. Such a search was only possible because several factors congealed during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, making such voyages of discovery profitable. These factors included the development of sturdy new ships that were capable of long-distance oceanic voyages, and the willingness and ability of merchants to risk some of their capital against the new commercial opportunities that a sea route to Asia would provide. There was also a growing confidence among mariners that they would survive oceanic voyages, thanks in part to the development of new navigational instruments and the accumulation of oceanic experience. Each exploration added to that experience and knowledge. Thus, the earliest voyages of the Cabots or the Cartier brothers, and others established for Europeans the existence of North America, while those of the next generation, such as Giovanni de Verrazzano and Jacques Cartier in the 1520s, 1530s, and 1540s, made clear that a sea route through North America did not exist. This left explorers searching for a northern passage around North America. The only other possibility was a sea route around the southern tip of the New World, and this would remain Spain's jealously guarded secret for several decades, being discovered by Magellan in 1520. In May 1498, John Cabot left Bristol to undertake another voyage of exploration, his third, from which he never returned. He only found new lands at the bottom of the ocean, wrote one of his contemporaries. His son Sebastian Cabot, son of John Cabot, himself a navigator, would later undertake to continue his father's explorations in North America. The Cartier brothers. King Manuel I of Portugal had been intent on preserving trade with Asia, since 1491. And, so, in 1500, intent on preserving trade with Asia, he asked Gaspar Cortereal to find a passage to the land of silks and spices by going northwest as Cabot had done. The Cortereal brothers were, as follows: Gaspar Cortereal, c. 1450, c. 1501, Miguel Cortereal, c. 1450, c. 1502, and Vasco Ains Cortereal. Gaspar was the son of the governor of Terceira in the Azores archipelago. This archipelago, situated towards Newfoundland from Europe, was and is still one of the major landmarks for Atlantic voyages. Because of his connection to the Azores, the Atlantic was not entirely new to Gaspar. Les Portugais ayant descouverts les rivages de l'Afrique en Orient, comme par la charge des rois catholiques fait le mesme en l'Occident, and comme chaque nation voulait avoir les Maluks en sa possession, Gaspar Cortereal en mccccc cherchant quelque passage auxiliary terrace des Espiceries trouva un fleuve où il appela Nevado, à cause des neiges and grandes froidures, mais ne pouvant supporter un si excessive froidure, fit voiles vers le midi, and descouvrit tout ces terrace. Jusqu'au cap de Malua. White Flight, 133, 1607. Gaspar Cortereal went in search of lands to the west, and the king granted him the profits from anything he found. In 1500, he reached a cold, snow-covered land in the northwestern Atlantic. The following year, in 1501, Gaspar made a second voyage with 3 ships and found Terra Verde, Greenland, so called because of its tall trees. Only 2 of the ships returned, bringing 57 captured Beothuk, who were then sold as slaves to defray the costs of the voyage. The third ship, with Gaspar and all his crew on board, disappeared. In the spring of 1502, Gaspar's brother Miguel Cortereal left Lisbon to look for his brother. He, too, would disappear. In 1503, Vasco-Anes Cortereal, a third brother, was refused permission by the king to continue the search. The Cabot's explorations and those of the Cortereal brothers revealed the large schools of cod and whales near Labrador. Breton, Norman, Basque, and Portuguese fishermen rushed to explore these by the beginning of the 16th century. But, like the Cabots, the Cortereals did not leave descriptions of their voyages, other than that they reached the shores of eastern Newfoundland and perhaps Labrador, and they did leave a map, the Cantino chart, whereupon the coast of Labrador bears the name Terra Cortereali on many old maps. Though he didn't return from his second voyage in 1501, Gaspar's ships brought the kidnapped Beothuk back to Portugal, making this voyage particularly significant for Europe. These were the first native people of this part of North America that had been seen on the Iberian Peninsula. Like the native people whom Columbus had taken prisoner and brought back to Spain when he returned from the Caribbean, these 57 souls were extraordinary to the Europeans, and everybody wanted to see them, and they were sold into slavery and quickly perished. From the early 1500s, European vessels fished the northwest Atlantic waters of the Maritime and Quebec. Many countries sent boats to the Atlantic coast: France, England, Holland, Scandinavia, and Portugal. The British also used the fishing industry as an unofficial training ground for sailors who, after acquiring valuable experience at sea, could be pressed into service in the Navy. But France, its first documented fishing vessel, crossed the Atlantic in 1504, dominated the industry throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. France supported its migratory fishery for 2 major reasons: it was of tremendous economic value and provided a reserve of experienced sailors for the French Navy, which helped to maintain the country's status as one of the world's great maritime powers. France was the most important participant in the transatlantic fishery. It sent more ships overseas than other nations, harvested more fish, and maintained a near monopoly of Newfoundland's south, west, and northeast coasts. Within just a few years, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of fishermen were sailing annually to the rich fishing grounds he had stumbled upon. Most fishers came from either Brittany or Normandy, which were located on France's northwest coast and therefore ideally situated to exploit Newfoundland and Labrador fishing grounds, soon to be joined by the Portuguese, the Basques, and the English. Some also came from La Rochelle and other areas on the country's west coast, while Basques fishers and whalers from southwest France also migrated to Newfoundland and Labrador. The first documented Breton fishers arrived in 1504. Within 4 years, both Breton and Norman vessels were regularly crossing the Atlantic in increasing numbers. So many nationalities were represented in this new enterprise that historians commonly speak of the 16th century as the era of the international fishery. French ports were annually dispatching between 60 and 90 vessels by the 1520s, and the industry steadily grew in the coming decades. Portuguese fishermen were impressed by the reports of schools of fish near Newfoundland. Cod fishing developed so rapidly after the Cortereal voyages that, as of 1506, Portugal levied a tax on cod from Newfoundland. In fact, Newfoundland bears the name of Terra de Bacalaos, land of cod, on some old maps. In 1507, the geographer Martin Wald-Seemiller startled Europe with a new globe that suggested Columbus and his successors had traveled to a separate continent from Asia, one previously unknown to Europe. Wald-Siemler's globe and an inset on his world map revolutionized the cartography of the New World and introduced the place name America after a minor Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci. As the notion of a new continent slowly gained credibility, expeditions were sent to find a way through the inconvenient landmass. At the beginning of the 16th century, several European countries were determined to find a sea route to the rich trading countries in the east, one that would bypass the treacherous overland journey through the Ottoman and Muslim empires. The Portuguese, who were then the reigning masters of navigation, had just succeeded in finding such a route, but it involved braving the turbulent waters around the Cape of Good Hope, at the tip of Africa. With Portugal soon dominating the African route and the southern parts of America under Spanish control, England and France had little choice but to look for another way. They surmised that the answer could lie to the north of Spain's American possessions. Although the Cabots and the Corte-Reals reported their sightings of North America, it was descriptions by Basque fishermen of these new lands and waters that had a substantial impact on the French. They were the first to pursue the Northwest Passage. Sebastian Cabot was born in Venice, Italy. In 1509, he was the first navigator to try to circumnavigate the New World by going north. He may have gotten as far as the entrance to Hudson Bay, which he took to be the passage to Cathay, China, but he had to turn back as his crew refused to go any further. In 1512, Sebastian was hired by Spain, whom he served, first as navy captain, then as pilot major, from 1518 to 1547. At the age of 63, he retired to England, where he died in 1557. Jacques Cartier, the explorer. Jacques Cartier, a famous sea captain of St. Malo, France, the discoverer of Canada, sailed up the majestic St. Lawrence in 1535, and wintered his fleet of 3 small sailing vessels, the Grande Hermine, the Petite Hermine and the Emerillon, at the mouth of the stream still known as the Larret, named after a pioneer settler of Charlesburg, which flows into the St. Charles River, now within the limits of the city. It was Jacques Cartier who named a bay on the north shore of the Gulf, which he entered on the feast of St. Laurent, August 10, Bay Saint Laurent, translated St. Lawrence. It was not until 1608 that Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec and built his habitation or fort in the lower town, directly below Dufferin Terrace. The childhood of Jacques Cartier also remains obscure. Researchers have few documents, some acts of baptism from the years 1510 to 1520, in which the young man acts as godfather, attest to his presence at St. Malo. He would have sailed in his young age as a moss, then as a sailor and, finally, as captain or so historians think. This is, in fact, the normal path of a young Malouin who wants to make a living while sailing. In 1524, Giovanni de Verrazzano, a Florentine in the service of the King François I of France, explored the east coast of America from Florida to Newfoundland, and, in 1525 and after, Basque cod fishermen and whalers regularly sailed into the St. Lawrence estuary and the Saguenay River. Subsequent voyages by Verrazzano, 1524, and Gomez, 1525, coasted from Florida to Newfoundland. Although they could not find a through passage, they produced rough charts of the coast. The best of these were Spanish charts by Ribeiro, 1529, and Santa Cruz, 1541. All of these charts show Cabot Strait as a bay, and some, such as those by Santa Cruz, depict Nova Scotia as an island. Canadian historian Gustave Langtot reports, in a biography of Cartier, that concept seems logical. He was then 27 years of age and possessed the necessary knowledge to navigate on his own. In his marriage certificate, celebrated a year later, when he married Catherine des Granges, daughter of a wealthy notable of St. Malo, sister of Jean Guyon, Sieur des Grands Ches, Vicomte de Beaupré et Thaumetz, it is specified that Cartier was master pilot in the port of St. Malo, Jacques Jean Guyon son of Madeleine Emerd and Mathurin Guyon, son of Jean Guyon, Sieur de Grand Ces, Vicomte de Beaupré et Thomet's brother of Marie Catherine Guyon dit Grand Ces, a mason, married Madeleine Hude. And they were the parents of Percheron Jean Guyon dit Buisson. Cartier could not have acceded to this position without having recognized his professional qualities recognized. It should also be noted that the port of St. Malo was the most important point of transatlantic departure from France at the time, and that the master of the port was the one person who controlled all the entries and exits of the ships, a responsibility which could not be trusted to just anybody. In 1532, François definitely brought Brittany into the French fold. Without news of Verrazano, whom was gone back a long time in America, François looked that year for an explorer to continue the work already undertaken. The abbot of Mont St. Michel, to whom the king made inquiries of / for such a man, recommended, to him, Sieur Jacques Cartier, pilot-sailor of St. Malo, as able, in consideration of his journeys to the Brazil and Newfoundland, and ability to drive ships on to discover new lands in the New World. A meeting took place at the abbey, and the Malouin captain came out with the mandate to discover this kingdom is Terras Novas and those isles and countries where it is said that he must find a large amount of gold and other things. And Cartier even knew where this place was, viz. Past the destroict of the Bay of Chastolques, which is called today the Strait of Belle Isle. There is no record of how much time Cartier spent at sea after the acquisition of his ship, nor of how he occupied his time. Yet, in addition to trips to the Labrador coast, the story of his 1534 trip reveals interesting details about his career. According to this text, Cartier clearly knows Brazil and its inhabitants. Information in this sense appears in two places. For example, when he talks about the habits of the Amerindians encountered in the Bay of Gaspe, in July 1534, he observed that they eat grosh millet, as a pitch as well as it grows in Brazil. Elsewhere, in the story of Cartier's second voyage, the Breton captain notes that the Indians were organized in the manner of the people of Brazil. They resemble the people who live almost in a community of good enough kind of Brazilians. As no document has been found concerning his explorations to Brazil between 1524 and 1528, it is not hard to infer that his trip to Brazil could fit well with this period of his life. Cartier's journey of 1534. Jacques Cartier had been navigating for many years when, in 1534, King François I of France dispatched the first Cartier expedition to discover certain îles et pays oul on dit chu ils doit trouver grande quantité d'or et autres riches, shows certain islands and lands where it is said there are great quantities of gold and other riches, as well as, if possible, the route to Asia. Cartier, with 61 men, probed a westward opening north of Newfoundland that had been reported by Basque fishermen. He explored and named the shores of the Gulf of St. Lawrence and was sailing in the waters of the Strait of Belle Isle as evidenced by his travel account. 2 years were needed to mount the expedition that led Cartier to Canada. The month of April 1534 was already well advanced. The Breton expedition had only 2 ships whose names have remained in oblivion. The small squadron, which brought 61 men, took off on the morning of the 20th, after having listened to Mass in the Cathedral of St. Malo. The crossing only lasted 20 days, other later passages could take up to 3 months. The newfound land appeared to the crews as of May 10, but the presence of ice delayed their entry into the Strait of Belle Isle. 17 days later, the 2 ships skirted the Labrador coast under the experienced conduct of the Malouin captain. He knew the coast, knew how to dodge the rocky bottoms, identified the harbors in passing and gave names to them, Blanc-Sablon, Budas, and Les Islets. These details have convinced historians that Cartier knows these areas. The small harbor of Brest, a simple fishing spot on the coast, seemed his goal, and he so went directly there on June 10. He anchored there for a few hours, time to make provisions for water, renew his wood reserves and give a break to his men. He resumed his voyage the next day and sailed towards the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Now, it is clear that he was unaware of the landscape and the pitfalls of navigation. He gave names to places where he stopped, and, on June 12, he baptized the harbor of St. Servan, named after a small port in front of St. Malo. Jacques Cartier says, without artifice, having simply planted a cross there, in truth at the limit of the geographical area he knew. In other words, he officially fulfilled his mission, that of taking possession of the territory, without ceremony, as if it was a routine. However, now that it was completed, he had the choice to continue exploration of these new lands, or return to France, but, as the sailing season was still very young, he kept on. Cartier then sailed the French squadron along the west coast of Newfoundland, to which its captain leads it and continues its course under varying conditions. The temperature was sometimes bad, other times mild. His two ships arrived at the Magdalen Islands, turned their naves to the New Brunswick coast, and then sailed back to the Gaspé Peninsula. Arriving at the entrance to the Chaleur Bay on July 4, and thinking to see there a possible passage to the Indies, Cartier stopped for a week at the Conque St. Martin, today Port Daniel. The exploration led to nothing, nevertheless, he continued on his way although it was stormy. The bad weather forced Cartier to seek refuge at Cape Prado, the Cove of Purse, then in a bay that he found on his way, that of Gaspé. We posed at the entrance until the 16th, which was Thursday, hoping to have a good time out. Jacques Cartier. Beautiful weather being desired, and one of his ships having lost an anchor, Cartier brought his two boats inside the bay and stayed there. It was the morning of July 24 when François Envoy was in the heart of an area unknown to him in relation to that of the Strait of Belle Isle, that he officially took possession of Nouveau France. This time, he put more emphasis on the gesture, which is why historians have chosen this date rather than the first to recall the accomplishment of his mission, and, on Sunday, June 24, 1534, planted a cross on Gaspé Peninsula and claimed the land for France. The next morning, July 25, the weather was nice, and Jacques Cartier resumed the sea. Cartier's expedition sailed along the St. Lawrence River and, in 1535, he stopped in a little bay he named Bay Saint Laurent on August 10. And, on September 6, Cartier became the first European to discover l'Île Auxiliary Coudray, Quebec. Cartier continued to sail up the St. Lawrence and arrived at the village of Hochelaga, Montreal, on October 2. Wanting to impress the inhabitants of Hochelaga, Cartier put on his dress uniform, ordered his sailors into formation and entered the Iroquoian village to the sound of trumpets et autres instruments de musique, trumpets and other musical instruments which the local people had not seen before. After the festivities, the hosts brought Cartier to the top of Mount Royal, from which they explained the major waterways by showing him the rivers on the horizon that came from huge freshwater seas to the west. They also told him that the gold, silver, and copper objects in their possession came from the northwest. Cartier concluded that the passage to Asia could not be very far. Passia si mostroro no consegni, che passate det tre cadud, si potua navigar per detto fiume il spatio di tre lune, and che lungo di det montagne che sono verso tramontana ve un fiume grande, il quale descende de ponent cum il detto fiume, noi pensamo che quello sia il fiume che passa p il rime di Saguenay. And senza che li faces simo demanda o segno alcuno presero la catena del subiato del capitano che era di argentu, and li manico del pugnal di uno de nostri compagni marinari, qual era di un giallo quanto loro, and il pengiua del fianco, and si mostroron che quello veniua di sopra di detto fiume, and che six sono di agovian da che vuol dire maluig genti, e quali vanno armati fino in cima del dita, mostrandati la forma del arm loro, li quali sono fat di cord and legno. Lavorat and tissued insiern, dandasi ad intendere che detti agovian da di continuo fanno guerra tra loro. Ma per difetto di lingua non potamo intendere loro quanto spatio vi era sino un detto paese. Il capitan mostrò loro del rame rosso, qual chiamano Canadjuns dimostrandoli consegni vol tendusi verso detto paese l'idema en da se veni de quel parti, and eglano comenciarano a croller il capo volando dir no, maban ne significarano che veni da sagane, qual dalla bonda contractaria del precedente, nc. Remugio 448, 1565. French translation. Etil nous fut dit et monter par signes, par les trois hommes du pays qui nous avaient condits, tu il y avait trois autres sauts d'eau sur l'état fleuve, comme celui où uatayent nos barques, mais nous ne pûmes comprendre quelle distance il y avait entre l'un et l'autre, par faute de langue. Puis ils nous montrayent par signes que, passé les sauts, on pouvait naviguer plus de trois lunes sur le fleuve. Et sans que nous leur fichions aucune demande en signe, ils prirent la chaîne du sifflet du capitaine, qui est d'argent, et un manche de poignard, qui était de l'étain jaune comme de l'or, l'équal pendait au côté de l'un de nos compagnons mariniers, et montrerent que cela venait de l'élément du fleuve, le capitaine leur montre du cuivre rouge. Chu ils appellent Canadjuns, indiquant vers l'état lu et demandant par signes silv de la. Et ils commenceront à secouer la tête, disant que non, en montrant chu il venait du Saguenay, qui est à l'oppose du précédent. Cartier 205-206, 1992. Being unable to go over the Lachine Rapids in his boats and very short on rations, Cartier returned to winter at Stadacona. The French exchanged European goods with the native people for wild game meat, but this food was not enough. 25 Frenchmen died of scurvy before Cartier learned from the native folk that a tea called annetta, made from some evergreen bark and foliage, could cure the disease in fewer than 8 days. The fleur-de-lis, a symbol of the French presence in North America. It is unclear where the fleur-de-lis originated. Among the Egyptians, Persians, Arabs, and Greeks, this arabesque evoked warrior-like power. It may be a Christa, a sun symbol associated with the power of pagan warriors, or even a stylized phallus suggesting fertility. Brought back from the Crusades, the symbol became tied to the history of French kings after Louis IX's canonization as Saint Louis on August 11, 1297. In depictions of the king's life, a Christa shines above his head by God's will. This tongue of fire, a biblical symbol, meant that the kings of France were chosen, crowned, and granted their power by God. Scattered across North America in the wake of explorer Jacques Cartier, the fleur-de-lis represented the figure and supremacy of Francis I, assigned by his sovereign to discover certain islands and countries where there are said to be great quantities of gold. Cartier sailed to Newfoundland and then Gaspé. He raised one cross at St. Servan Harbor on June 12, 1534, to show that the country where he had landed belonged to the Kingdom of France. A second was assembled and raised at Gaspé on July 24. A coat of arms with 3 fleurs-de-lis in relief was fixed on the crosspiece, and above it a wooden sign engraved in large Gothic letters with Vive l'Roi de France. Some 60 years after Cartier's voyages and the bid by Jean-François de la Roque, Sieur de Roberval, to colonize the St. Lawrence Valley, Samuel de Champlain spent time in Acadia, from which he explored the St. Lawrence Valley and the Atlantic coast. He did not display the fleur-de-lis, then embodied by Henry IV, anywhere he went, not even when he founded Quebec City in 1608. He did not invoke it when his city surrendered in 1629, or when he returned to the city after the Treaty of Saint-Germain was signed on March 29, 1632. However, the expression retour des lis, return of the fleurs-de-lis, was used to describe his last voyage to Quebec City in 1633 and renewed efforts to colonize New France. The fleur-de-lis continued to symbolize France's dominion over Canada when Louis XIV came to power on March 9, 1661. That autumn, Governor Pierre Dubois de Beauregard, upon seeing the St. Lawrence River for the first time, found it to be a favorable place for the fleurs-de-lis to settle. In 1673, Governor Louis de Buade de Frontenac endowed Quebec City with liveries and arms depicting the fleur-de-lis, a beaver and two moose. Champlain and the founding of Quebec. The symbol traveled far beyond the St. Lawrence Valley as explorers advanced and took possession of North America with instructions to display the king's coat of arms. In 1670, Intendant Jean Talon reminded them that they should draw up memoranda to serve as titles. The following year, at Sainte-Marie-du-Sault, the French raised a cross bearing the arms of the French king, taking possession of the territory from the Mer du Nord, Northern Sea, and Mer de l'Ouest, Western Sea, to the Mer du Sud, Southern Sea, including both discovered and as yet undiscovered lands, in other words, all of North America. A stone marked with the fleur-de-lis and the date of possession was generally buried in the ground at the base of the cross as evidence in the event the sovereign's rights were disputed. In 1683, a fleur-de-lis was applied to the piastre circulating in Canada to guarantee its value and weight. This administrative decision was reminiscent of an initiative by Louis XIII, who was the first French king to strike a coin whose value he backed with his own coffers. The Louis d'Or, gold Louis, was recognized by the cross and fleur-de-lis engraved on it. In New France, the fleur-de-lis appeared on one of the cornerstones of Notre Dame Church in Montreal. It was sculpted over the Dauphin Gate of the fortress of Louisbourg. Gold and silver threads were used to embroider the fleur-de-lis onto the opulent church vestments of François-Xavier de Montmorency-Laval, who became the first bishop of Quebec City in 1674. A fleur-de-lis seen on an average person was a sign of punishment, used to mark out anyone found guilty of a minor crime, such as servants who had left their master's employ. Known as a prisoner's brand, in 1681 it was the penalty inflicted on coureurs des bois who engaged in the fur trade without permission. Thieves, rapists, and murderers were branded with a fleur-de-lis before being hanged. The fleur-de-lis was tacitly abandoned after France finally ceded Canada to England in 1764, but Canadians, unlike French citizens after the French Revolution, were not required to remove the fleur-de-lis from churches, bells, or decorations. Friendlier relations between France and Canada grew out of the Crimean War, during which the two countries fought side by side. The victory at Sebastopol cemented ties that led to the resumption of diplomatic relations between France and Canada. The docking of the light frigate La Capricieuse at Quebec City on July 13, 1855 reflected this reconciliation, which was called the Return of the Fleurs de Lis, harking back to 1632. When Jacques Cartier traveled up the St. Lawrence River and planted a cross in 1535 on what would become called Isle Saint-Quentin, he was met by the people who had always been there, most likely the Algonquians. In 1603, it was estimated that the combined population of the various Algonquin tribes was in the neighborhood of 6,000 souls. Cartier took possession of the new territory in the name of the king and then, as did most explorers of the time, returned to France with Tino Agny and Domagaya, two indigenous men kidnapped at Gaspé in order, as Cartier wrote, to get information from them. On May 6, 1536, Cartier again returned to France, this time with 10 people from Canada, including Chief Donnacona, to repeat their stories of gold and silver found in the Kingdom of Saguenay, situated in the northern interior of Quebec. None of the First Nations folk taken to France would ever return to North America. On June 9, 1537, Pope Paul III proclaimed that since the Sauvages were real humans, they must receive the Roman Catholic faith. Then, in 1541, Cartier built Charlesbourg Royal Fort, the first permanent European settlement in North America, near the confluence of the Rivière du Cap Rouge with the St. Lawrence. The first attempt at colonization by the French in Canada. The king was convinced of the need to set up a colony and explore the country and its minerals further, named Jean-François de la Roque de Roberval, one of his courtiers, to head a new expedition of some 400 to 700 men and women, whom he was to govern. Cartier was named Captain General and Master Pilot of the vessels. As Roberval was late in leaving, Cartier weighed anchor first and, in August 1541, landed at the spot known today as Cap Rouge, where he set up the colony of Charlesbourg Royal. This was the first attempt at colonization by the French in Canada. Cartier had some gold and quartz crystals extracted, which he thought were diamonds, before returning to Hochelaga with the intention of getting over the Lachine Rapids. The difficulty and the length of the portage, as well as the description of the numerous rapids that followed, discouraged his crew. On his return to Charlesbourg Royal, hostile natives revealed an important incident. Only Thevet's testimony and that of some Basque fishermen supply the facts. Some foolish French youth, who wanted to demonstrate the efficiency of their swords, had severed the limbs of some native people. This led the Charlesbourg Royal Iroquoians to retaliate, and they attacked the French, spending the 1541-42 winter with Jacques Cartier at Charlesbourg Royal, Cap Rouge, Quebec, killing 35 of Cartier's men. Thevet explains the reason for slow colonization in a passage describing how the Indians make torches. In zs voulurent ils défendre contre les premiers, qui allèrent découvrir leur pays, faisans effort, avec quelques graisses and wills, de mettre les folanuict es navires des autres abords au rivage de la mer. Don't les nostres informés de cette entreprise, y donneront tel ordre, chu ils ne furent aucunement incommodes. Toutefois j'ai entendu que ces pauvres sauvages en avoyant machine cette entreprise, que justement, and à bonne raison, considèrent les tort chu ils avoyant reçu des autres. C'est chu estes les nostres descendants entiers, aucans junes folastres par passé temps, vici toutefois, and isinables, comme par un manière de tyrannie coupoyant bras en jams à quelques uns de ces pauvres gens, seulement desoyant ils pour essayer, leurs esprits tranquillant bien, nonobstant que ces pauvres barbares les eussent reçu humanum, avec qu'ils tout douceur en amity. Etpar in z depuis not permis aucans cresciens aborder en metropi à terre en leurs rivages en limites, Thevet 157, 1558. After surviving a winter under constant threat of attack, Cartier returned to France. He crossed paths with Roberval near Newfoundland, but refused to obey the order to turn back. The explorer would be blamed for disobeying his superior, for the failure of this first attempt at settlement, and for his false diamonds, and other minerals thought originally to be gold and silver. Etienne Cartier died in 1549. He had lived to see his nephew Jacques add to the fame of the family through his trips of exploration and his discovery of Canada. Jacques Cartier died at Saint Malo in 1557. As the first person to inform Europeans about the St. Lawrence River, its populations, and its natural resources, Cartier has found a better reception in history than he received in his own time. However, even Champlain, Cuvier, who had great regard for Cartier, later said that his predecessor could have accomplished more if he had left the safety of his own ships on the ships used by early explorers. The ships used by early explorers such as Cabot and the Corte-Reals were much different than the Viking Nars of 500 years earlier. By the 16th century, sailing vessels had become sophisticated pieces of technology, carrying vast expanses of canvas manipulated by many meters of ropes and spars. They had 3 masts, and along with square sails they carried at least one lateen-rigged, triangular, sail that hung across the wind, making it easier to tack and steer. Vessels were carvel-built, that is, the planks of their hulls formed a smooth skin rather the overlapping style favored by the Vikings. They were broad vessels, built to withstand the heavy beating of the stormy North Atlantic, but they were not particularly large, since smaller vessels handled better in unknown, coastal waters. John Cabot's ship Matthew was only 50 tons, meaning it could carry 50 tons of cargo, with a crew of less than 20, Martin Frobisher's Gabriel was even smaller. Jacques Cartier penetrated the St. Lawrence River in the Grande Hermine, somewhere between 100 and 120 tons in size with a crew of 60, but John Davis ventured into ice-coaked Baffin Bay in a vessel of only 18 tons. Life aboard these small vessels. Life aboard these small vessels was uncomfortable to say the least. Crew's quarters were cramped, dirty and cold. Fires were lit only in calm weather and washing facilities were non-existent. Food rations were very monotonous. Frobisher's men, for example, received daily a half-kilogram of dry biscuit, 4 liters of beer, preferable to water, which went stale, a kilogram of salt meat, some dried peas, a quarter of a salted fish, and some butter, cheese, rice, oatmeal, raisins, and nuts. Furthermore, the absence of vitamins, i.e., fresh fruit and vegetables, made scurvy a constant threat. One mariner of the time summed up the seafaring life as follows: a hard cabin, cold and salt meat, broken sleeps, moldy bread, dead beer, wet clothes, want of fire. Besides a compass, used to establish which direction was north, 16th-century navigators possessed a small number of instruments to help them find their way across the empty ocean. Using an astrolabe, a quadrant, or a cross staff, they could measure the angle above the horizon of the North Star or the Sun at noon and thereby calculate the ship's latitude, longitude being left pretty much to guesswork. Of course, skies were not always clear enough to permit the necessary observations. Next, speed was measured by trailing a line in the wake. Knots tied in the line at equal intervals could be used to calculate how fast the ship was going. There were no coastal charts, and early explorers had to keep a constant lookout for shoals and rocks. They used a weighted line dropped into the water to keep track of their depth, i.e., sounding. The ships that followed the explorers of the early part of the century tended to be larger and heavier. They were working ships, designed to carry cargo or colonists. The remains of one of these vessels were recovered from the water of Red Bay on the south coast of Labrador in the Strait of Belle Isle. It was the San Juan, a 300-ton galleon used by whalers from the Basque region of northern Spain. Wrecked in a storm in 1565 and preserved for more than 400 years in the mud at the bottom of the bay, the San Juan is one of the oldest shipwrecks located in Canada. Its discovery has revealed a great deal of information about the vessels used by the earliest European visitors. The Newfoundland's fishery industry. The remarkable speed and intensity with which Europeans began exploiting these waters of riches reveals much about Europe in the 1500s. The vitality of the fishery was a result not only of the abundance of cod but also of the strength of market demands brought on by population expansion, urbanization, and commercial growth at home in Europe. Europe's exploitation of the New World fishing grounds was vigorous, and only possible because the necessary seafaring skills, fishing technologies, curing methods, and markets had already been well developed, thanks to the long-existing European fisheries in the Irish Sea, off Iceland, and elsewhere. The Newfoundland fishery was an extension of a well-established domestic industry that served established domestic markets and employed tried and tested methods to catch, preserve, and deliver fish. It is important to understand that fish was never the food of the poor. By the time fish from North American waters were caught, cured, transported, and delivered to market, most Europeans could not afford them. Yet, as the population of Europe grew, and as Europe became more urbanized, there were enough Europeans who could afford it, and for whom a diet that included fish was desirable. There was soon a constant, ready market for fish delivered from the New World. Perhaps most important to the development of the fishery was the fact that the fish found in such abundance in Newfoundland's waters was cod. Unlike herring, mackerel, or salmon, cod is relatively fat-free and preserves well using techniques involving salt and air drying. In fact, the flesh can become so dehydrated that it becomes remarkably light in weight, making it perfect for transporting not only by sea but also overland. All these factors were significant to the fishery: the abundance of cod, the simplicity of catching it, the ease of preserving it, the relatively low cost of transporting it to markets both coastal and inland, and the growing demand in Europe by those able to afford it. Combined, these things made the fishing grounds of northeastern North America truly waters of riches that attracted the attention of Europeans from the moment they were discovered. Throughout 1554, French and Spanish Basque vessels off the coast of Labrador battled each other. on the maps created by early explorers. With the 3 Cartier voyages, 1534, 1535, and 1541-2, the geography of the St. Lawrence Valley first appeared on maps. None of Cartier's original charts have survived. Those believed to be closest to his originals are a chart of the first expedition drawn by the cartographer Jean Rots, 1542, and the Harleian map, 1547, and 2 maps by Pierre Descaliers, 1546 and 1550, of the later expeditions. These last 3 maps attached the name Canada to the north coast of the St. Lawrence, near Quebec. According to Cartier, the word meant a village in the language of the Iroquoian people who lived there. In addition to these French maps, there are others in Portuguese and Spanish, such as the beautiful Spanish map made for Nicolas Vallard in 1547. Few printed maps of the period deserve consideration. The exception is the famous world chart by Gerard Mercator, 1569. It introduced the Mercator map projection, on which a straight line is a line of constant compass bearing. As such, it became indispensable to navigators and consequently much copied. Practically all the maps showing Canada, to the end of the 16th century, were based on Mercator's map. After Cartier's expeditions into the St. Lawrence Valley and the earlier ones south of Newfoundland showed that there was no western opening to Asia, further searches were abandoned. It was the English who now attempted to find a northern passage to the west. The existence of such a route had been first theorized by Sebastian Cabot circa 1508-09 and appeared on most early maps, but an effort to find it was first undertaken by Martin Frobisher in 1576. Only his first of 3 successive expeditions resulted in exploration. The other 2 were attempts to mine gold on Baffin Island. The published maps, 2 by James Bear, 1578, a captain of one of Frobisher's ships, and 1 by Michael Locke, 1582, were so crude that cartographers had little idea where Frobisher had been. On later maps the strait, Frobisher Bay, he thought was a western passage, appeared on the southern tip of Greenland. John Davis' 3 voyages, 158,587, first appeared on maps in the 1590s. The maps by Mercator, 1595, and Whiteflyet, 1597, are representative of Davis' contribution. The magnificent world map by Edward Wright, published by Richard Hakluyt in 1599, best illustrates 16th century accomplishments. It is an honest depiction of the known world, uncluttered by myth and unsubstantiated hypothesis. Martin Frobisher, privateer. A poor student but with a keen interest in navigation, Martin Frobisher learned from his maternal uncle, Sir John Yorke, with whom he was living, that Asia was a land of boundless riches. At the age of 14, in 1553, Frobisher went to Guinea for the first time. He was lucky, only 1/4 of the expedition returned and he was among the survivors. The following year, during a voyage to the same country, an African chief took him hostage for some months. Until 1573, Frobisher was a privateer, but brought so much back to Queen Elizabeth's treasury that his imprisonments for piracy never lasted long. Wandering the ocean, Frobisher developed dreams of finding a passage to Asia through the northwest. After 15 years of perseverance, Frobisher found investors to finance his project and attracted support from the Crown. On June 7, 1576, Frobisher left Ratcliffe with 35 men on 2 ships. The Queen saw them off at Greenwich. Going through the Shetland Islands, they set sail west, towards Greenland. At the end of July, Frobisher's ship alone reached an unknown coast and entered a bay that the explorer assumed was a strait, and which he named Frobisher. Toward the end of August, using sign language, Frobisher bartered red meat for trinkets with some Inuit. 5 sailors visited the Inuit against orders and were never seen again. A short while later, Frobisher seized an Inuk and his kayak and brought them back to England. The Inuk and his craft were marveled at by Londoners, just as the Spaniards and French had previously marveled at indigenous peoples. Sadly, the Inuk died of a cold shortly thereafter. Of prime importance to Frobisher, however, an expert found gold in the piece of mineral that he had brought back, allowing him to find sponsors of a second expedition. The ship owners of the first voyage regrouped under the name Cathay Company to sponsor Frobisher's second voyage. Virgin Queen Elizabeth I granted him a considerable sum of money and a ship, the 80. This time, he was asked to mine for gold and to have only one ship explore. He left, on May 31, 1577, from Harwich with 3 ships and some 120 men, including 30 soldiers and 11 gentlemen. Frobisher looked for the 5 men who had disappeared the previous year and found their bloodied clothes. Before returning to England, he captured an Inuit man, woman, and child to bring with him, and a battle, in Frobisher Bay, ensued between Inuit warriors and the English expedition led by Martin Frobisher. The Inuits' bows and arrows got the better of the English harquebuses and bows and Frobisher was wounded. The captured Inuit would all die approximately 1 month after arriving in England, and the approximately 200 tons of mineral, marcasite, that Frobisher brought back would not be promising enough for the investors, who were becoming ambitious and required more. The day following, being the 19th of July 1577, our captain returned to the ship, with good news of great riches, which shewed itself in the bowels of those barren mountains, wherewith we were all satisfied. A sudden mutation. The one part of us being almost swallowed up the night before, with cruel Neptune's force, and the rest on shore, taking thought for their greedy paunches, how to find the way to Newfound land. At one moment we were all rapt with joy, forgetting both where we were, and what we had suffered. Behold the glory of man, tonight contemning riches, and rather looking for death than otherwise, and Tomorrow devising how to satisfy his greedy appetite with gold. Hakluyt 624, 1589. The following year, Frobisher directed a fleet of 15 vessels carrying some 400 men, with the mission of setting up a colony and bringing back to England 2,000 tons of rock. Leaving on May 31, 1578, some of the fleet drifted for weeks in Hudson Strait due to ice and bad winds. One of the vessels sunk with some of the construction wood on board, but the crew managed to save itself on the ice. The crew of another ship abandoned the fleet and returned to England. Frobisher managed to land with the rest in a little arm of Frobisher Strait. He called this inlet Countess of Warwick Sound, and from it he searched for minerals. With only coal for heating, Frobisher had a house built of stone and lime with a wooden roof, hoping to assess during a future voyage how these construction materials reacted to northern cold. Frobisher was to have left 100 men and continued mining, but lack of food, the breakage of the casks with the beer rations, and the loss of the construction wood for a house made a colony impossible. Back in England the following autumn, Frobisher continued his career in the Navy while the mineral that had been brought back was analyzed. The result, it contained no gold. The Cathay Company went bankrupt. Frobisher finally managed to get to Asia in 1585. He was Vice Admiral under Sir Francis Drake who, with 25 ships, inflicted heavy losses on the Spanish fleet and the Spanish colonies in the East Indies and returned with immense booty. In 1588, he was knighted for his services in important positions against the Spanish Armada. He continued to harass Spanish ships until 1594, when he took a bullet in his side during an assault. He died a few days later at Plymouth. Frobisher's voyages to Baffin Island were the first European attempt to mine mineral wealth from the Canadian Arctic. However, because he did not return with any maps or detailed navigational descriptions, the English could not discern where he had been. Hakluyt and his contemporaries placed Frobisher's Strait on the southern tip of Greenland. John Davis, the master navigator. John Davis, half-brother of Sir Walter Raleigh, had the good luck to have very special childhood neighbours in his home and birthplace of Sandridge, Devonshire, Humphrey and Adrian Gilbert, as well as their half-brother, Walter Raleigh. All three would be famous for their explorations, their sea adventures and their relationship with Queen Elizabeth I. The first two were older than Davis, but Walter was his age. In addition, one of Davis' personal friends was John Dee, the great astronomer and mathematician. Thus, very early on, Davis was in touch with the explorers, cartographers, and scientists of his time. We don't know where he studied, but he was not yet 30 when his knowledge of navigation and scientific cartography was recognized. Like many of his contemporaries, he was convinced of the existence of a northwest passage that led to Asia, and his great ambition was to discover it. Through his friends, he met the Queen's secretary, who convinced the sponsors of Martin Frobisher's exploration a few years earlier, to finance his expedition. The motivation for the sponsors was that the Northwest Passage would allow the English to trade in Asia without crossing Portuguese and Spanish territories. Davis left Dartmouth on June 7, 1585 with 2 ships, and followed the same route as Frobisher, passing south of Greenland, where he met some of the Inuit of that country. Heading up the west coast of Greenland, he then crossed to Exeter Bay, on the coast of Baffin Island. The observations he made during this first voyage led him to believe that the passage to Asia was either west through Cumberland Sound or north of Davis Strait. The following year, Davis undertook another voyage in the same area. 2 of the 4 ships of the expedition were sent to explore the east coast of Greenland. Davis sailed the other 2 into Davis Strait up the west coast of Greenland to 67° north latitude. A barrier of ice forced them to head southwest to Baffin Island and then south as far as the estuary of Hamilton Inlet, where native people attacked the crew. 2 men were killed and others wounded. Despite this incident, the English sailors took the time to fill their holds with cod before returning to England in October after a 5-month voyage. Not satisfied with his results so far, the persevering explorer took to sea again on May 19, 1587. This time, Davis reached 72°12' N on the west coast of Greenland before being pushed back by violent winds. He headed southwest following the margins of the ice drifting from the Arctic to the coast of Baffin Island and sailing south to Cumberland Sound and Frobisher Bay anew. Passing by Hudson Strait, he was struck by strong water currents at that location. This phenomenon would be described as a furious overfall on the Hakluyt map and the Molyneux globe. The current and the ice prevented his going further with his light ship, so he headed south along the Labrador coast to a cape, which he named Chidley, and entered the Labrador Fjord, which bears his name today, Davis Inlet. Before returning to England in mid-September, he passed by Hamilton Inlet again to cover at least part of the expedition's costs with a catch of cod. Davis' second voyage. The 7th of July, being very desirous to search the habitation of this country, I went myself with our new pinnace into the body of the land, thinking it to be Firme continent, and passing by a very large river, a great flaw of wind took me, whereby we were constrained to seek succor for that night, which being had, I landed with the most part of my company, and went to the top of a high mountain, hoping from thence to see into the county, but the mountains were so many and so mighty as that my purpose prevailed not, myself having easy yet a very strange sight, especially to me that never before saw the like, which was a mighty whirlwind taking by the water in very great quantity, furiously mounting it into ease, which whirlwind was not for a puff or blast, but continually for the space of 3 hours, with very little intermission, which fifth it was in the course that it should pass. We were constrained that night to take by our lodging under the rocks. Hakluyt 783, 1589. Davis primarily described the Inuit of Greenland, where he had stopped, but we can perhaps infer something about the Baffin Island Inuit from his observations. Davis' friendly approach towards the Inuit changed when he discovered that they had stolen his anchor. They had become displeased with their visitor earlier, when Davis interrupted their religious ceremonies. Davis' accounts tell of the many difficulties involved in the meeting between Europeans and Inuit. Even though he did not progress further west in the continent than Frobisher did, Davis greatly contributed to Europe's knowledge of the Arctic and to the conducting of subsequent explorations. He drew maps of long stretches of the coast of Greenland, Baffin Island, and Labrador, and recorded observations of the ice, relief, rock formations, temperature, vegetation, and animal life of these areas. The log of his third voyage still served as a model for ships' logs 3 centuries later. Though the original maps of his voyages are lost, the results of his discoveries are found on the maps of his time, including the Hakluyt, 1598 to 1600, map of the world, and the Molyneux globe, QV. The accounts of Davis' voyages were published by Hakluyt, beginning in 1598. After his 1597 expedition, Davis no longer returned to the Arctic, but he did reach Asia. He got there for the first time in 1598 as a pilot with one of the expeditions conducted for large commercial companies. In 1600, he became chief pilot for the first expedition of the East India Company. On his 3 voyages to the Indies, he drew geographical maps and records information that was important for navigating in the Orient. On December 27, 1605, off the coast of Malaysia, Davis was assassinated by one of the Japanese pirates whose ship he had just captured. In 1598, following the 1521 landing on Sable Island southeast of present-day Nova Scotia by the Portuguese, the French establish a settlement.